To God be the glory.
Welcome back to our study, Evidence for Christianity. In this class, we're going to transition to look at external evidences for the Bible's inspiration. In the transition from internal evidences to external evidences, we first need to take a note of the Bible's place in documented history. The Bible is the most well-documented work in all of history. This should bring incredible confidence to the internal evidences discussion that we had on unity and consistency, because we're not dissecting and evaluating only a few fragments of information with absent sections or holes in its completeness. Rather, we're analyzing and discussing a work whose individual phrases, words, and even strokes of letters are comparable across thousands of ancient manuscripts. But manuscript evidence, or sometimes it's called the bibliographical test, also builds the case from an external evidence perspective. This makes the textual discussion of the Bible as relevant and even dramatically more appropriate than even some of the great literary works of the ancient world, which well-studied men and women spend years analyzing. I want to show you a table of well-known ancient works. And we want to take note for when they were written, the date of their earliest existing manuscript, and the number of separate manuscripts and fragments that are found. In this table, we have it organized by chronology, ordered from the top to the bottom for oldest to most recent. First, in that first row, we have the Old Testament beginning with Moses, writing the Pentateuch around 1500 BC, and then the prophet Malachi writing somewhere around 400 BC. So you can see that the earliest manuscript or fragment for the Old Testament is dated around 600 BC. Now, that's well after Moses wrote the Pentateuch, but it actually is still before Malachi and some of the later prophets were written. This fragment, and actually it represents two fragments, they're known as the Ketaf Hinnom scrolls, and they include quotations from both the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy. Also, take note that the number of Old Testament manuscripts in existence is well over 10,000. You know, Old Testament fragments are scattered around the world in museums and libraries and private collections. And because of their history and antiquity, some of them have not been cataloged in detail. And so here we're just talking about a conservative, lower number estimate of 10,000 manuscripts. The next work on this list represents fictional literature that was written in a contemporary time as the later books of the Old Testament, somewhere around 800 BC, and that is the Iliad by Homer. It's the most extensive and oldest secular work in the world. This ancient Greek epic poem has been a classic work of study and classic work for plays for over 2,000 years. And up until the 1990s, there were only a little over 640 confirmed papyrus manuscripts known to exist for the Iliad. But some large discoveries since then have increased that number to almost 1,800. 1,800 fragments and manuscripts and papyrus documents. Now, as we move through the historical works noted on the chart, we have some foundational historical documents and people represented. Plato represents one of the most well-known philosophers of history, while Herodotus, Livy, Tacitus, and Pliny the Elder represent ancient historians. And you can quickly see that for all that is discussed and respected for these secular works, these works never claimed inspiration from God. And you can also see that their manuscript evidence is all based on really a couple of hundred or less manuscripts. All right, so the first comparison to consider is the fact that the Iliad and much of the Old Testament were similar times in history in terms of when they were written. However, when you look at the number of ancient manuscripts and the evidence for them, the Iliad, which is the largest, most well-documented on this list, has only about 20% of the manuscript documentation as compared to the Old Testament. That's significant. It's also significant that as we move through the historical works, we see that these historians who were writing, that some of the earliest manuscripts for many of them are in the range of hundreds to maybe even well over 1,000 years from the time that they were originally written. Okay, so the date of the earliest manuscript, okay, so the copy that was transmitted, that was shared, that was passed, the copy that we have in existence being hundreds of years, and like I said, in some cases, 1,000 years. So now, when we compare the New Testament manuscript evidence, we see quite a contrast, especially when we think about the contemporary secular works of, say, Tacitus or Pliny the Elder, which was much closer in time, overlapping in time. The Greek manuscripts of the New Testament have been extensively analyzed and cataloged through the years, and the number is over 5,700. All right, so I want you to look at that number and kind of take note. 5,700 manuscripts that are available for the New Testament analysis and textual criticism. This means that it's well over 50 times more manuscripts than Herodotus. Herodotus, a respected, a well-known Roman historian. Sometimes he's called the father of modern history. Okay? Also, the New Testament has 25 times more than the works of Plato or Pliny the Elder, and over 3 times more than the most documented ancient secular work in history, the Iliad. And we had talked about how just in the last couple of decades that number had increased, but you can see the increase is still far below the manuscript evidence that the New Testament has. All right. On top of that contrast, for the Greek New Testament documents, 5,700, it's also good to note that very early in history, the New Testament books began to be translated into numerous languages. Latin, Syriac, Coptic. Latin being one of the earliest, most widely used. But as you can see from the chart, Latin language manuscripts of the New Testament, well, those add another 10,000 documents to our discussion and to evaluation. And then one more important component to consider. The fact that the earliest New Testament fragment, known as the Ryland Papyrus, P52, is dated in the early part of the 2nd century. Okay, so that's somewhere around AD 100 to 150, sometimes given the date 125. This papyrus fragment includes a quotation from John chapter 18, which means it was made only around 50 years after John wrote his account. All right, so the earliest fragment of the New Testament in Greek is only 50 years. We're only talking a few decades apart from when John penned his account, penned his gospel, and it was being spread within the church. All right. Now, we think about not just the manuscript evidence and the historicity that is embodied when we evaluate the text in Scripture, but then if we look at a second external evidence called factual accuracy, all right, related to the internal unity of the Bible's message and its details, is the evidence of the factual accuracy when you compare it to external sources. All right? So when we read the Bible and we read passages that give to us facts and details and events, things that could be evaluated externally, that's what we're looking at. All right? So if we think about it, if a book wanted to avoid contradiction, avoid mistakes in regards to what it contained, what's one thing that it could do? Well, it could write in generalities. It could give good statements or good thoughts. It could be a little bit vague on details, trying to just give you a little bit of a sense, but not open itself up to evaluation. Now, when we seek to evaluate the Bible's inspiration, it's provided ample specifics. You know what? The Bible has opened itself up to being analyzed, evaluated, and critiqued. And that's significant when we think about the external perspective, trying to consider the Scriptures. Are they inspired of God? And if they contain mistakes, then they're human-made. If it's fully accurate, well, then that is an evidence for inspiration. All right, when we think about the Bible contains over 2,500 proper names. Proper names for men and women, individuals spoken about, included in events and history, activities that were going on, things that were said, part of conversations. 2,500 specific names. It also contains 1,500 specifically named places. All right? These places could be political in nature, right? Countries or nations, cities that existed. It could also be geographical references, all right? So regions of the world, valleys and mountains, seas and rivers that people went to or visited or events happened around. All right. The Bible, again, has opened itself up to being evaluated. It's not just some sort of generic or vague reference to something that happened and that could apply to a host of people. Instead, it gave specifics, people, places, events, things that happened that allow us the opportunity to see, is it consistent within its own pages, right? Because sometimes even man's writings aren't consistent from one end to the other. But also, is it consistent with the context that it finds itself in? All right, I want to take a look at some of these and show some lists, consider some people and places, nations, and such. But before I do, I want to bring up a claim sometimes made by atheists or skeptics, okay, about the details of the Bible. And I want to mention this claim because sometimes it is used to counter this line of reasoning, right? And they'll say that specifics are meaningless. You know, lots of fictional stories, they include real places and they include some real items and they might even have some real people or specified people in them. And so the claim might be worded something like this: you're just making a Spider-Man fallacy, right? The Spider-Man comics are set in a real place, New York City. They talk about real things, right? Buildings and cars, newspapers. They name specific people, right? It says Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson, Harry Osborn. So you are just like someone in the future digging up a Spider-Man comic and saying, all of these stories, they must have happened true and real, right? You're making this Spider-Man fallacy. All right. But here's the problem. When a skeptic claims that, saying the Bible is no different than a Spider-Man comic or pick your fantasy or fiction novel that you enjoy. When you compare those two, here's the problem, all right? We're not considering the context of the internal claims or external evidences, right? When we pick up the Bible claims to be inspired of God. We started our discussion talking about the inspiration of the Bible, talking about its own claims. Because if the Bible, this book, if it doesn't claim to be from God, we shouldn't apply it to it arbitrarily. We shouldn't even investigate whether it is or it isn't. We could just read it, kind of like we do with a Spider-Man comic, right? The Bible claims to provide historical accounts. Do the Spider-Man comics claim to be inspired? No. Do they claim a historical nature? Do they claim to be providing real events? No. They don't claim either of these. We read them as fanciful stories, and that's it. All right. I hope that if someone far in the future ever digs up a Spider-Man comic, it could happen, right? They're doing archaeology in the future and they dig up and here's a Spider-Man comic or maybe some other written story or document. I hope that they would use their common sense. I hope that they would evaluate and look at what it says and use that context for the degree of concern that they ought to have. If the Spider-Man comics did claim inspiration or historical truth, then we should employ the same lines of evaluation, right? We should apply to them just like we do all the other areas of our lives. When we're trying to determine truth and what's accurate, what's valid, we think about what it contains. All right. I want to show you a rather large list of specifically named and identified individuals from the Bible whose existence has been externally verified by ancient historians, inscriptions on tablets, inscriptions on prisms and cylinders, both text and even large artistic reliefs on the walls of ancient palaces, and even from enormous obelisks, statues, busts, and monuments, because all of these things declare to their existence. All right. Here is a list of historically verified Old Testament individuals. All right? People that within the pages of the Old Testament are specifically named and given a context. Some of the names might seem familiar to you, right? Artaxerxes, Ashurbanipal, Cyrus or Darius. Maybe you recognize Nebuchadnezzar or Pharaoh Necho. Maybe you recognize Sargon II, Sennacherib, Shalmaneser V, all right? Maybe some of these names ring a bell in historical discussions or writings. Some of the rulers of large empires. We're going to take a look at a few of them here towards the end of this class. Maybe some that are a little less well known, but take a look at this list, right, from A to X. Dealing with Ahab, dealing with Belshazzar, dealing with Jehu, names that are given in Scripture, but yet we find them verified in external sources, in inscriptions and monuments and such. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. I want to show you a second list, okay? And this list brings to our mind names found in the New Testament, all right? Previous list of all of those names, Old Testament individuals. Here we have New Testament individuals. All right, so you might recognize some of the Herods, all right? Herod the Great or Herod Agrippa. Maybe you recognize Pontius Pilate or Tiberius Caesar or Claudius Caesar, maybe Gamaliel, all right? So every name on this list from A to T are names of people that we have discovered, right? Through science, through archaeology, through investigation and evaluation of inscriptions in different languages and papyrus fragments. These individuals have been named, not named in terms of a Bible story, not named in terms of some sort of Christian writing. Instead, in the writings that form our secular understanding. All right? If we combine these lists to a degree, okay, and we begin to look at the names that are confirmed by, say, ancient writings, all right? So these ancient writings might be things relating to inscriptions and tablets. They might be things that are on manuscripts, in histories that are given and the such. And this combines both Old Testament and New Testament. So the full scope of history. And we see, while many of these names that we are talking about that are on these lists, while many of the names are rulers, right? Okay, those might be the easiest because they have authority, they have power, they're giving proclamations, they're declaring laws, they're governing, they're on coins, right? They are commissioning the building of monuments. Okay, so these are some of the names that might be the easiest to connect with history. But again, that's not necessarily a problem because we can see a vast number of them. And just maybe one other list to kind of fashion just a little bit differently is to think about a list of inscriptions, okay? So instead of maybe in writings of tablets that are in libraries and in the papyrus fragments, if we think about inscriptions on large monuments or stelae, these large slabs of stone that sometimes are records of events and history, maybe accolades, accomplishments by rulers or nations. And so here we see a range of names that are confirmed by inscriptions in archaeology. All right. Very similarly, we could populate a list of not just, say not individuals, but say the nations that composed some of those individuals and rulers that formed their own empires. We have things like the Ammonites and the Amorites. We have some big empires, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persian, Greece, Rome, but then lots of small nations that are referenced, all right? Edom, Egypt being a big one at one time, and then we see kind of Egypt's fade and transition through Scripture. But there's the Moabites and the Hittites and the Hivites. We have the nations of Israel and Judah and the Canaanites and those that surround them. Maybe smaller tribal groups that are also mentioned, but all of these nations shown in this fairly simple list bring to our minds the fact that the Bible is talking about not fanciful, not mythological, but it's applying specific names that we see in Scripture, that we dig up in the ground and find records describing it. So I want to take just a couple of specific examples, not necessarily trying to generate a discussion of archaeology per se, but just to give some examples connecting some of the names that we've seen, nations and people. So let's start with the small nation of Moab. All right. The Mesha stela, or Moabite stone, is an ancient inscription from the mid-9th century, all right? So the mid-800s BC. This stela is a black basalt monument, all right? It's written in the Moabite language, and it was found in the ruins of ancient Dibon, there in Jordan. And on this stone monument, we have the verification of Mesha, all right, who the monument is kind of named after for our records. Mesha was the king of Moab. All right, so here we have this large stone monument that was set up by a Moabite king by the name of Mesha. We read about Mesha and Moab in the Bible. But on this, we also have references to Israel and to a specific king, King Omri. Now, he's not a well-known Old Testament figure, but he's there in our Old Testaments, discussed, all right? Not a good king, but one that was a king of Israel. And so in the Old Testament discussion, when we look at the passages, we see interaction between Moab and Israel, between Omri and Mesha. All right, so here is a nice external evidence for multiple people, multiple nations. Then we turn maybe to a larger empire, say the Assyrian Empire. All right, excavations at Khorsabad excavated Sargon II's royal palace. All right, before the capital was shifted and moved to the city of Nineveh, where coincidentally, or later on, another palace was also found with lots of inscriptions. But here at Sargon's palace, we have a ruler who had this enormous palace, all of these monuments, references to himself and to conquests and things that happened. But but he's also potentially the Assyrian leader, the Assyrian ruler, who finished the deportation of the northern tribes of Israel. You see, the scriptures talk about Shalmaneser. Shalmaneser was ultimately deposed by Sargon. All right, so Shalmaneser came in, began the conquest of northern Israel. Potentially Shalmaneser V finished that conquest, but Sargon was a military leader, deposed Shalmaneser, and in some of his writings talks about how he conquered northern Israel. Well, we understand that maybe a ruler who is now a new lineage, a new line, he has to establish himself some way. But whether what he said is correct or not necessarily our evaluation. It's the fact that his name is recorded in relation to Israel. His name is recorded in relation to Shalmaneser. Shalmaneser's name is recorded in relation to Israel and Old Testament. And so here we have multiple people, multiple things happening, but all of them following the context that we find in Scripture. All right, if we look at Sargon II's son, Sennacherib, we have a prism discovered that is called the Taylor prism. And this prism, all right, a large 15-inch tall hexagonal prism, it mentions numerous people and places that are consistent with Old Testament references. It mentions Merodach-Baladan, king of Babylon. It mentions various kings of the Medes and Sidon, a Hittite land, Ashkelon and Egypt and Hezekiah the Jew. That's right. Not only is this list a list of places he's conquered, places that he has put under tribute, but on this prism, it talks about the fact that Sennacherib came down to siege Hezekiah the Jew, king of Judah. So here we have an external verification of the history of these empires, their dealings in and out of Israel and Judah. All right, another major empire, that of Egypt. The existence of Egypt is well documented, right? Large-scale structures, the pyramids, right? Statues and sphinx, temple monuments, obelisks, ruins. Egyptology, a formal name given to the study of this particular civilization and language and history. The Egyptian Empire is well documented. Well, it's also referenced and mentioned in Scripture, and not just mentioned in a vague way, right? We have history going back to when Joseph was in the land of Egypt, but we also, coming forward, as the Egyptian Empire began to wane and decline a little bit, we have several pharaohs that are referenced in Scripture, one of those being Pharaoh Hafra. Pharaoh Hafra, there is a Sphinx statue to his glory or his representation in the Louvre Museum of France. We have various inscriptions and obelisks in various European countries and around the world that reference and talk about Hafra, very similarly discussion that we find in Scripture. We also find in this case not only these major large-scale, what we might think of as archaeological connections, but we also have historical writings of those who came later documenting and referencing this. And so we talked a little bit about Herodotus early in the lesson. Herodotus, in his histories, talks about Pharaoh Hafra. Also, Diodorus, in his library of history, references Hafra. All right? If we think about another historical empire, that of Babylon. All right? Babylon, one of the rulers, Nebuchadnezzar. We had him individually on a list earlier. We had the empire on our nation's list. But here, there's lots of archaeological evidence, but just to talk about one in particular, there is a small tablet that's about 3 by 2.5 inches wide. This small tablet is called the Nebuchadnezzar or Jerusalem Chronicle. And this tablet chronicles some of the engagement that Nebuchadnezzar had with Judah. All right? Specifically, the tablet talks about the conquering of Jerusalem. It mentions Jeconiah. Jeconiah surrendering to Nebuchadnezzar, and the fact that Nebuchadnezzar would install a new king, kind of a puppet king, right? Zedekiah. When we look at Scripture, what do we find? We find Babylon, Jeconiah, Zedekiah, and these events happening. But again, not necessarily evaluating the external accuracy on a tablet versus what's in Scripture, but just to say this tablet exists, confirming all of these specifics mentioned in Scripture itself. All right? So these empires that we see, and maybe even ending with another last one, the Medo-Persian Empire. There is a cylinder called the Cyrus cylinder that details an account very similar to what we find in the Bible of allowing captives to go back to their homelands. But Cyrus is also mentioned in the works of Herodotus and Josephus, Arrian, the Nicomedia, and others. So we have these external verifications, all right? Now, while we've provided what may seem like large lists of people, of nations that are recorded in Scripture, this is just a sampling. There are dozens more mentioned in the Bible, in the pages of Scripture, Old and New Testament, that are also known from their historical accounts and histories. When we think about what this means, I hope that you have seen how the internal consistency of Scripture that we find, that we discussed earlier, also has an external historical consistency aspect. And that carries over to provide evidence for the Bible's inspiration. You know, in the intro to this course, I said that there would be something for everyone, and hopefully those of you who love history, those of you who have a passion for reading about these historical records and places and people and events and trying to understand the context that they lived in, hopefully for that kind of enthusiast, you've enjoyed this first class and our discussion. But please join us for more external evidences for the Bible's inspiration.